The wine came down before Billy Rourke understood what was happening. 1 second, she was carrying a tray past the head table of the Grand Ballroom in one of Boston's finest hotels. The next, dark red liquid ran across her hair, her cheek, her neck, and down the front of her uniform. The glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the stone floor. Billy dropped to one knee. Her right palm found a shard, and she heard herself draw breath. Standing over her was Sabine Voss, the face that had appeared that evening on 300 invitations and 17 posters around the city, still holding the stem of the glass, not blinking. She said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. "You need to learn what you are." 300 guests turned their heads. 38 camera lenses lowered. Not one person stood up. Then the service corridor door at the back of the room opened, and a man walked in. A man this hotel addressed by the title of chairman, and the old men in the North End called by another name entirely. Rafe Santangelo stopped in the middle of the aisle. He looked at the woman he was going to marry, standing tall. Then, he looked at the young woman kneeling on the floor. What nobody in that room knew, including him, was that she had spent 4 years getting herself into that building, on that exact night. If you believe a person's dignity is never measured by the work they do, please leave a like on this story, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. Then tell us where you're watching from today, your city, your state, or your country. 9 months before that night, Billy Rourke lived by a rhythm no one in that ballroom could have imagined. At 4:15 in the morning, she reached out and shut off the alarm before it had the chance to ring. It was a habit she'd trained herself into over the past 6 months because the house in Dorchester was too small, and her mother slept in the room right beside hers. Deirdre Rourke hadn't slept through an entire night since March of that year. Billy, dressed in the dark, didn't turn on the hallway light, and walked barefoot across the wooden floor, circling around the one board that creaked. She left the house at 4:45, and the hotel was 40 minutes away by 2 different trains. The banquet shift began at 6 o'clock in the morning. She carried trays, arranged chairs, folded napkins, polished the bases of candlesticks, and by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, she could no longer feel either of her calves. She went home, ate standing in the kitchen, usually whatever was left from the night before, then sat down at the sewing machine in the corner of the living room. It had belonged to her grandmother. It was heavy as an anvil, ran quietly, and hadn't broken down once in more than 30 years. That week, she had 13 pairs of pants that needed hemming before Friday. People paid her $12 a pair, 15 if the fabric was difficult. She worked until midnight, sometimes until 1 o'clock in the morning, then slept for 3 hours and started all over again. A caregiver came for her mother 6 days a week, 6 hours a day, and cost Billy $1,900 every month. Her father had paid off the house before he died, so all that remained for Billy and her mother were the taxes and insurance, and that was the only reason the arithmetic still worked at all. Billy never said that number aloud in front of her mother, but Deirdre had managed the family's household accounts for 30 years, and there are some things a person doesn't need to hear in order to know. She would often roll her wheelchair to the kitchen doorway at around 11 o'clock at night, stop there, and watch her daughter sew. She didn't turn on another light. She didn't speak while Billy was guiding the needle. She simply sat there, both hands resting on the rims of the wheels, and watched. Some nights she sat that way for 40 minutes straight. Then one Wednesday evening, just after Billy cut the thread on the 9th pair of pants, Deirdre spoke. She asked her daughter whether she was sewing for other people, or sewing her own mouth shut. Billy looked up. She smiled, the same kind of smile she used at the hotel when a guest said something unpleasant, and she didn't answer. She lowered her eyes, threaded a fresh strand through the needle, and kept working. Deirdre sat there a while longer, then wheeled herself back to her room. She never asked that question again. Around midnight, Billy ran out of black thread. She pulled open the second drawer of the sewing cabinet. Inside, beside several spools of thread and a box of needles, lay an envelope yellowed along the edges, and beneath it was a thick stack of documents held together at the spine by 3 black binder clips. The file was thicker than it had been the year before, and the year before it had already been thicker than the year before that. Billy took out the spool of thread. She looked at the envelope for exactly 1 moment, no longer than the time it took simply to see it. Then she closed the drawer and went back to the 10th pair of pants. 20 minutes later, she heard the faint sound of wheelchair wheels moving down the hallway, then stopping. She didn't look up. There were things in that house that both mother and daughter knew, and both had silently agreed not to speak aloud. A little after 1 o'clock in the morning, Billy turned off the light, stacked all 13 pairs of pants neatly on the chair, and went to bed. 3 hours later, she reached out once again and shut off the alarm before it had the chance to ring. The The Windmere had its rules, and Gideon Pruitt was the man who read them aloud every Monday morning. He stood at the front of the employee break room with both hands clasped behind his back and repeated the same 3 things he'd said the week before. Don't look guests directly in the face. Don't speak unless you're spoken to. Don't argue, ever, even when you're right. Then he added a sentence Billy had heard so many times that she'd memorized the rhythm of every pause. He said that here, you don't have opinions, you have shifts. When he finished, he looked around the room once, not to see who was nodding, but to see who wasn't. Billy always nodded. She'd learned a long time ago that a nod was the cheapest thing a person could pay. Marisol Quintero, the morning shift supervisor, usually stood beside her during those meetings and couldn't hide the exhaustion on her face. Marisol had worked at the Windmere for 8 years, had a son in 1st grade, and knew exactly what those 3 rules had been created to do. They weren't there to serve the guests. They were there to make certain that if anything went wrong, the person in the uniform was always the one at fault. But Marisol never said that aloud, and Billy never asked. The morning shift began at 6 o'clock. Most employees arrived at the staff entrance around 5:50, early enough to clock in and swallow a mouthful of coffee before heading down to the basement. Billy was different. Billy was always in the back courtyard by 5:35. She stood in the right-hand corner beside a stack of empty crates, beneath a strip of corrugated metal roofing that kept off the rain and also blocked the view from the second-floor office windows. She stood there holding a cup of coffee that, most mornings, she barely touched. At exactly 5:40, the first truck turned in. The food delivery truck, refrigerated compartment, driver climbing down first, opening the side door, rolling a handcart toward entrance number 2. 3 minutes later came the linen truck, carrying tablecloths and napkins and clean uniforms, pulling in at entrance number 3. Last came the waste processing truck, slower and louder, turning around at the corner of the yard before backing up to the loading platform. 3 trucks, 3 different arrival times separated by only a few minutes, and the same embossed logo stamped on the side of each vehicle. Billy had looked at that logo so many times she could have drawn it from memory, including the place where the paint had chipped away at the lower left corner of the garbage truck. The one with a license plate ending in 4 digits, she also knew by heart. She didn't talk to the drivers. She simply stood there and watched, and took her first sip of coffee when the final truck pulled out of the yard. Once, on a February morning so cold that every breath turned to mist, Marisol came outside looking for her and asked why she didn't wait indoors where it was warm. Billy said she liked the morning air. Marisol studied her for a moment, then laughed and told her she was the hardest working one on the team, and that Pruitt ought to know it. From that day on, in the quarterly staff evaluation form, beneath Billy Rourke's name, there was a handwritten note from Marisol stating that this employee always arrived earlier than required. Pruitt read the line, nodded approvingly, and didn't give it another thought. 9 months, 6 days a week, Billy hadn't missed a single truck. She knew the company name printed on the refrigerated unit, knew which laundry company operated behind the linen truck, knew the abbreviation printed on the lids of the waste bins, 3 different names, and if someone took the trouble to trace them backward, all 3 led to the same place. Billy had traced them. She'd done it before she ever submitted her first job application. On the final morning of that month, when the garbage truck turned around at the corner of the yard, the driver leaned his head out the window and gave her a nod, the casual greeting of someone who had grown used to seeing the same face. Billy nodded back. Then she took her first sip of coffee for the day, dropped the cup into the trash, and went in through the employee entrance at exactly 5:53, just as she did every other morning. 9 months after that February morning, the Windmere received its largest ballroom booking of the year. It was the closing night of Boston Fashion Week, and at the same time, the unveiling of Sabine Voss's new product line. Pruitt gathered the entire banquet staff 4 days beforehand for a meeting that ran longer than usual, and he repeated the same 3 old rules before adding a 4th. He said that on that night, the banquet area would admit adult guests only, with no exceptions. No one was permitted to bring family members, and any employee who appeared in the film crew's frame without being asked would have to explain themselves. 300 guests. The list had been closed 2 weeks earlier, and no additions would be accepted. A 3-camera film crew had been hired personally by Sabine's team to make a documentary. The crew leader was a young woman named Priya, and the contract stated clearly that the cameras would run continuously from 6:15 in the evening until the final guest left the room. Marisol assigned the shifts. Billy was placed on the wine-pouring team for the main tables, a position Marisol normally reserved for employees with more seniority, and she had thought about it for quite a while before writing Billy's name down. She told Billy that the main tables belonged to the sponsors, that not a single glass could be wrong there, and that she trusted her. Billy thanked her. That night was also the night the Second Thread Foundation released its annual report. The backdrop behind the stage carried a sentence the fashion press had repeated like a prayer for the past 2 years, that the foundation existed to give young designers their first opportunity. Beneath the words was a portrait of Sabine Voss, photographed in profile, unsmiling. The servers passed that backdrop perhaps 20 times during every shift on their way in and out of the kitchen, and not one of them stopped to read it a second time. At 6:15, all 3 cameras began recording. At 6:40, the first guests entered. By 7 o'clock, the ballroom was full, and the sound of voices rose toward the high ceiling in a thick, steady swell, so blended together that no single sentence could be separated from another. At 7:15, the main doors opened, and Sabine Voss walked in. The entire room turned at once, not because anyone had been warned, but because it was instinct. She moved slowly, paused for exactly 3 beats in the center of the entrance so the cameras could catch up, then continued forward. The dress she wore that night was the dress anyone who had opened a magazine in the past 2 years would have recognized. The bodice was covered completely in beads, and the beads weren't arranged in the usual downward direction, but reversed, overlapping in layers like fish scales turned the wrong way, making the light travel across them in the opposite direction from the movement of the woman wearing them. It was the thing that had carried Sabine Voss out of Boston and onto the runways of Europe. It was her brand signature, and it was the reason the product line being unveiled that evening existed, because the entire collection was nothing more than that same pattern brought down through 9 different price levels. Billy was carrying a tray from the kitchen toward the main tables when Sabine entered. She was halfway down the side aisle, about 15 steps from the stage. She saw the dress before she saw the face of the woman wearing it, and she stopped. It wasn't long, only half a second, about as much time as an ordinary person takes to blink. And there were 300 people in the room turning their heads in another direction, so no one noticed. But Marisol was directly behind her carrying a tray of her own, and she nearly walked into Billy's back. She reached out and touched Billy's elbow, lightly, the way people reminded each other to keep moving during a crowded shift. Billy started forward again. She walked the rest of the aisle, set down her tray, arranged 12 glasses in a row exactly as she'd been taught, and didn't look toward the stage again for the next 20 minutes. Marisol did ask her one question, whether she was all right. Billy said she was fine, that she'd only felt a little dizzy from standing so long. Marisol nodded and went back to her work. In the ballroom, all 3 cameras kept running. On stage, the master of ceremonies began reading an introduction about the journey of a woman who had created her own style with her own hands. The trouble began at 7:40, and it began with the light. Sabine Voss sat down in the chair at the head of the main table, looked up at the lighting rig overhead, and told the technician that the light in the room was too yellow. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke in an ordinary tone, and precisely because it was ordinary, the 3 people standing nearby fell silent at once. The technician explained that the ballroom's lighting system was permanently installed, and that only the brightness could be adjusted, not the color tone. Sabine listened to the entire explanation, then repeated the exact same sentence, that the light in the room was too yellow, and that there were 3 cameras running tonight. Pruitt appeared in less than a minute. He ordered all the ceiling lights over the main table lowered to their dimmest setting, and had 6 portable spotlights from the film crew brought over, temporarily positioned behind the guests, and aimed upward at the ceiling so the light would reflect back down. It took 14 minutes and delayed the appetizer course for all 300 guests. No one complained. Sabine looked at the result, said nothing, and that was understood as approval. The second incident came at 5 minutes to 8. She picked up the place card set in front of the seat to her right, read it, and put it back down. Then she called for Pruitt. The card listed that guest's title as Chief Executive Officer, even though he had become chairman of the board in April. Pruitt said he would have the card reprinted immediately. Sabine said not one card. She said that if one was wrong, there was no reason to trust that the others were correct. And she wanted every place card at the main table checked against the list, right now, on the spot. There were 12 cards at the main table. Marisol and 2 other employees had to kneel on one knee beside the table, holding the printed list, reading each line and checking every title, while the other 11 guests sat silently and looked down at them. It lasted 9 minutes. The 3 cameras never stopped recording. At table number 9, about 7 steps from the main table, an old man sat with his back straight and watched for all 9 of those minutes. Everett Coyle was 79 years old, invited that night as a guest of honor, and the place card in front of him bore 4 words: Craftsman of a Generation. He had held a pair of shears in Lowell for 44 years. He knew exactly how long it took to reprint a place card. And he also knew that those 9 minutes hadn't been about correcting a card. When everything was finally finished, Sabine asked for wine. Marisol started to step forward, but Sabine lifted her hand and pointed, and her finger pointed directly at Billy. Billy approached from the right side of the chair, tilted the bottle, poured exactly 1/3 of the glass as she'd been taught, and stepped back half a pace. Sabine didn't look at the wine. She looked up, and her eyes settled on the chest of Billy's uniform, where a black metal name tag with white lettering was pinned. It read Rourke, period, B. Sabine read it. Then she froze. It lasted exactly half a second. No longer. The same amount of time Billy had stopped in the aisle 45 minutes earlier. During that half second, Sabine's face didn't change, but something in her eyes did, and Billy saw it. And Everett Coyle at table number 9 saw it too, because he happened to look up at precisely that moment. Sabine picked up the wineglass, turned it halfway around, looked at the light shining through it, and said there was a mark on the glass. Billy said she'd replace it immediately. Sabine said there was no need to rush, that perhaps the problem wasn't the glass. From that moment on, everything at the main table began moving in a single direction. The napkins weren't folded with sharp enough edges. The wine had been poured half a centimeter too high. Her footsteps passed too close behind a guest's chair. Each time, Sabine spoke just loudly enough for the neighboring table to hear, and each time, someone was named, and it was always the same person. Marisol tried 3 times to step in and replace Billy, and all 3 times Sabine said she wanted to keep the current server. At table number 9, Everett Coyle set down his knife and fork and didn't touch his food again. It happened at 8:22, and it happened in less time than a single breath. On stage, the master of ceremonies had just mentioned Sabine Voss by name, and her phone was lying face down to the right of her plate. She reached for it. Her elbow swept across the stem of the wineglass sitting near the inner corner of the table. The glass tipped. The wine spilled in a long streak across the tablecloth and ran over the edge, and the part that spilled over fell directly onto the beaded skirt of her dress. Billy was standing 3 steps away, holding the bottle in both hands, not touching anything on the table. Sabine shot to her feet. She looked down at the skirt of her dress, then looked up, and she said Billy had spilled it. She didn't ask. She stated it as fact, in that same ordinary voice, the kind of voice that made people believe even when they'd just seen the opposite with their own eyes. There were at least 5 people in the ballroom that night who had a clear view of everything that had just happened. The guest seated to Sabine's left, the guest sitting across from her, Marisol standing 4 steps from the table with a tray in her hands, a server carrying dishes through the side aisle, and Everett Coyle at table number 9. Not one of those 5 people said a word. The guest on Sabine's left lowered his eyes and adjusted his napkin. The guest across from her turned and began speaking to the person beside him about something entirely different. Marisol opened her mouth, and Pruitt, who had already arrived from behind her, placed a hand on her shoulder, and she closed it again. Billy set the wine bottle down on the side table. She said she was very sorry for the inconvenience, that she would have clean towels and cold water brought over immediately, and that the hotel's laundry department could treat a wine stain on beaded fabric if it was handled within an hour. She said all of it in a clear voice that didn't tremble, and she didn't say she'd spilled the wine. Sabine listened to every word. Then she said she didn't need towels. She needed a proper apology, the kind of apology people gave when they knew they were wrong. Billy stood still. Pruitt stepped forward, bent slightly, said a few words to Sabine in a low voice, then turned back, took hold of Billy's arm just above the elbow, and led her around behind the stone column at the edge of the main table area. From there, they were hidden from the view of 3/4 of the room. He released her arm, and he began speaking very quickly, very quietly. He told her to lower her head. He told her to go back out there and say it properly, say it respectfully, say whatever they wanted to hear. Then he asked whether she had any idea what a night like this was worth. Billy said she hadn't knocked over the wineglass. Pruitt said he hadn't asked whether she had or hadn't. He said he was asking whether she had any idea what a night like this was worth. He said the hotel had spent 11 months securing tonight's contract, that there were 300 people out there and 3 cameras running, and that if she wanted to keep the name tag pinned to her chest, she had better understand what was happening. Then he stepped out first, leaving her behind the column. Billy stood there for about 5 seconds. From where she was, she could see nearly the entire room. She saw Marisol still standing exactly where she'd been, tray in her hands, her face drained white. She saw the guest seated to Sabine's left, now laughing with someone. She looked toward table number 9, and there, the old man who had sat with his back straight all evening, the old man who had put down his knife and fork and hadn't touched his food again, was looking down at the plate in front of him. He didn't look up. Billy stepped out from behind the column. She walked to the right side of Sabine Voss's chair, stopped at exactly the required distance, and said once again, loudly enough for the neighboring table to hear, that she was very sorry for the inconvenience, that clean towels and cold water had been brought over, and that she was prepared to do anything she could to make sure the guests' evening could continue. She didn't say she'd spilled the wine. Sabine looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached out, took a fresh glass from the table, and lifted it. Rafe Santangelo kept walking. He crossed the distance between the service corridor door and the main table without moving any faster than usual, and that was exactly what made the entire room keep its eyes on him. Sabine began speaking when he was still 4 steps away. She said she was explaining that this had been an accident, that this server had been making mistakes since the beginning of the evening, and everyone at the table knew it. Rafe didn't stop. He walked straight past her, past Pruitt as well, even as the man held out a hand as though he were about to say something, and Rafe dropped to one knee beside the person sitting on the floor. He took off his jacket without rushing, and draped it around Billy's shoulders. Then he looked up and said only one sentence, not loudly, that he needed clean towels, cold water, and a first aid kit. 4 people ran at once. 1 headed toward the kitchen, 1 toward the bar, and 2 toward the reception desk. Not one of those 4 people worked for him. Billy sat motionless on the floor, her right hand turned palm down and pressed tightly against her thigh. Rafe didn't pull at her hand. He held out his own, palm up, and waited. 3 seconds later, she placed her hand in his. He turned it over, and the first thing he saw wasn't the place where the shard of glass had just sliced through her skin. The first thing he saw was the callus on the tip of her index finger, thick and hard and faintly yellow, set slightly toward the inner side, the kind of callus only one thing in the world could create, and only after years. Rafe knew that callus. His mother had carried one for 30 years in the back room of an alterations shop in the North End, and he'd looked at it every evening throughout his childhood, and he'd held that same hand in the hospital on the final day of her life. He looked at the callus longer than he looked at the cut. Then he asked whether she could move her hand. Billy curled her fingers inward and opened them again. She said she could. He told her to keep the hand raised at the level of her heart, and not to clench it. Clean towels and cold water arrived. He took the towel himself, pressed it against the bleeding, and while he was doing that, he asked her name. She told him. He asked how long she'd worked there. She said 9 months. He nodded, and asked nothing else. Sabine was still standing 3 steps away. She said his name. Rafe didn't turn around. She said his name a second time, and this time she added that she was his fiancé, that he was kneeling on the floor in front of 300 people on her evening, and that he should stand up. Rafe handed the roll of bandage to the person who had brought the first aid kit, told them not to wrap it too tightly, then stood. He rose slowly, brushed one knee of his trousers once, and turned to face her. No one in the ballroom dared breathe too loudly by then, so when he spoke, all 300 people heard every word clearly. He said that being his fiancé didn't give her the right to humiliate another human being. Sabine laughed. She asked whether he knew who he had just said that in front of. Rafe said he knew exactly who he was speaking in front of. Then he asked her a question, and the question silenced the entire main table, because it wasn't the question of a man defending someone. It was the question of a man opening an investigation. He asked who had seen the first wineglass spill. No one answered. He didn't ask again. He simply stood there and looked at each person seated at the main table in turn, slowly, from left to right, pausing for exactly 1 beat on every face. The guest, seated to Sabine's left, looked down at his napkin. The guest across from her looked toward the stage. Not one of them could hold his gaze for more than 2 seconds. Pruitt began saying that this was nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding, that the hotel would cover every expense, that he had already ordered someone to take the employee down to the medical room. Rafe turned toward him and asked whether the ballroom had security cameras. Pruitt fell silent. The color in his face changed in less than a second, and the 3 people standing nearest to him all saw it. At table number 9, Everett Coyle had lifted his head at some point, and now he was looking straight toward the main table, both hands resting on the tabletop, perfectly still. At the far end of the room, where the service corridor door still stood open by the width of a hand, a man was standing there without stepping inside. Aldo Terzi was 63 years old, dressed in a dark coat, his arms hanging at his sides, and he'd been standing in that exact spot since the moment Rafe dropped to one knee. He wasn't looking at Sabine. He wasn't looking at the young woman sitting on the floor. He was looking at exactly one person in the room, and he was waiting. What he was waiting for was a nod. In 30 years of serving Rafe's father, Aldo had received that nod so many times that he didn't need a clear view of the man's face to know when it was coming. It was very small, only a single beat, and after it, everything in a room like this would be rearranged in a different way. Rafe's father would have nodded. The old man would have nodded before he even knew who was right and who was wrong, because to him, who was right and who was wrong was never the most important question in a room where 300 people were watching. Rafe turned his head toward the door. He saw Aldo. Aldo looked back, and Rafe raised his right hand to the level of his waist, no higher, then lifted one finger. Just one. He held it there for about 2 seconds. Aldo remained still for one more beat, then lowered his head in acknowledgement, turned, and disappeared into the corridor. The door closed without making a sound. There were 300 people in the ballroom that night, 3 cameras, and a row of spotlights aimed upward at the ceiling, but not a single person saw what had just happened at the far end of the room, except the 2 men who had spoken to each other with exactly one finger, and not a single word. Rafe returned to the question he'd just asked. Pruitt had managed to recover his voice. He said the Windmere Ballroom didn't have security cameras, had never had them, and never would. He said it had been part of the hotel's charter since 1981, adopted to protect the privacy of its guests, and that this was precisely why events like tonight chose this place instead of somewhere else. He spoke longer than necessary, the way people do when they believe they've just escaped something. Sabine leaned back in her chair. She crossed her legs, picked up her napkin, and lightly dabbed at the skirt of her dress, and something very close to relief appeared on her face. Rafe didn't look at Pruitt while he was speaking. He didn't look at Sabine either. He turned his head toward the corner of the room to the right of the stage, where a camera tripod stood beside the row of columns, and there was a young woman standing rigid behind the lens, both hands still resting on the camera body. Rafe asked her one question, and he asked it in an ordinary voice, no louder than the voice he'd just used when asking about Billy's hand. He asked whether she'd turned the cameras off at any point. The ballroom became completely silent. Priya swallowed, then shook her head. She said the contract specified that the cameras were to run continuously from 6:15, that she had 3 cameras, and that none of the 3 had stopped even once. When she finished speaking, she glanced toward the main table, very quickly, then lowered her eyes. No one needed anything else explained. All 300 people in the room did the same calculation at once, and the sound of the ballroom changed completely, from silence into a low, broken murmur, people turning to speak to the person beside them. Sabine put down her napkin. She rose halfway from her chair, then sat back down. Pruitt reached into his jacket for his phone. He pressed 2 numbers and lifted it to his ear, and he began saying that he needed security in the ballroom. Rafe didn't turn toward him. He only said, just loudly enough for Pruitt to hear, that the first truck entered the back courtyard at 5:40 tomorrow morning, and that he wanted to know how Pruitt planned to open for business if none of those 3 trucks showed up. Pruitt stood completely still for 3 seconds. Then he lowered the phone, ended the call, placed it on the tabletop, and sat down in the nearest chair without pulling it out first. They took her down to a private dining room on the first floor. A small room with 1 long table and 8 chairs, usually used for family meetings. The doctor arrived 20 minutes later. A middle-aged man from a clinic, 3 blocks away from the hotel, called in directly without going through the switchboard. He cleaned the cut, examined it under a light, and put in 7 stitches along the thenar eminence, the thick pad of flesh beneath the thumb of her right hand. He said the cut hadn't reached a tendon, which meant she would still be able to grip things normally, but the shard of glass had passed through a branch of a sensory nerve, and that was different. He told her to close her eyes, then touched the tip of a pen to the end of her index finger, and asked what she felt. Billy said she could feel something touching her. He asked whether it felt sharp or dull. She was silent for quite a while, then said she didn't know. He tried again on her thumb, and she didn't know there either. He said coarse sensation was still intact, but fine sensation was gone. The kind of sensation that lets a person tell how many crosswise threads run through the surface of a fabric without having to look down. He said nerves of this kind often recover on their own within 3 to 9 months. Then he added that sometimes they don't recover, and he said it in the voice of a man who'd had to say those words many times before. Billy sat still. She looked at her bandaged right hand resting on the table, and inside her head, without anything she could do to stop it, a calculation began to run. $1,900 a month for the caregiver. 9 months was $17,100. 13 pairs of pants a week. $12 each, multiplied by 36 weeks. She arrived at a number. then added the extra amount a hotel like this might pay to make the whole thing disappear quietly. And that number appeared in her mind with perfect clarity, as though it had already been written somewhere long before. Then she realized what she'd just done. She realized that less than an hour after sitting on the ballroom floor, she was here putting a price on herself. And she hated herself for that more than she hated anyone else in this building. Rafe Santangelo sat across from her. He'd been sitting there the entire time the doctor worked, saying nothing, and he still hadn't put his jacket back on because his jacket was around her shoulders. He didn't reach for his wallet. He didn't take out his phone. He didn't call anyone into the room. He simply waited until the doctor had packed everything away and left. Then he asked her what she wanted. Billy looked up. She said she needed a moment. He nodded and didn't rush her. She sat there for about another minute, and then she began to speak. And she didn't speak quickly, the way people speak when they've been thinking about something for a very long time before they ever had the chance to say it aloud. She said she didn't want money. She said she wanted the Windmere to have a written policy, a real one, stamped and handed to every person when they signed their contract, stating clearly that no guest had the right to touch an employee. No manager had the right to force an employee to accept blame for something they hadn't done, and anyone who reported something like that couldn't be reassigned to another shift, have their hours cut, or have a note placed in their file. She said that policy had to apply to everyone, starting with the dishwashers and going all the way up, not just the banquet staff, because the dishwashers were the ones nobody ever saw. Rafe asked if there was anything else. Billy said there was one more thing. She told him not to do anything to Sabine Voss. His expression didn't change. Billy continued, saying she wasn't asking that for Sabine, that she didn't owe that woman anything at all. She said she was asking for herself. She said that if he hurt someone on her behalf, then starting tomorrow she would become something different. And she'd already lost enough, and she wasn't going to lose that too. The private dining room was silent for about 5 seconds. Rafe Santangelo looked at her longer than he'd looked at anyone else that evening. Then he said, "All right." He said he would do it her way. And he added that this was the first time in his life anyone had ever sat across from him, in her position, and hadn't asked for a single cent. When Rafe returned to the ballroom, the party still hadn't ended. But it was no longer the same party it had been 40 minutes earlier. People were still sitting at their tables. There was still wine in their glasses, but no one was looking toward the stage anymore. At the main table, the chair at the head was empty. Sabine had gone upstairs to change and hadn't come back down. Whitaker Voss, 66 years old, sat 2 seats away from where his daughter had been, and he was the only person at that table, still sitting with his back straight. He had remained completely still ever since the young woman behind the camera shook her head. When Rafe entered, Whitaker Voss placed his napkin on the table, stood, and fastened the button of his suit jacket with the clean, practiced motion of a man who had been doing it for 40 years. He didn't look at Rafe. He didn't say a single word to anyone. He walked toward the main doors, and when he passed table number 3, a man sitting there stood and followed him. Then another man rose from table number 5, then 2 more from table number 7. 5 men left the ballroom in less than a minute, no one saying goodbye, no one shaking hands, and the main doors closed behind them. Of the 300 people who remained, not everyone understood what had just happened, but about 30 of them did, and those 30 were the people who mattered. The 4 men who followed Whitaker Voss all sat on the Harbor Line Port Development Council. That council would vote in March on the redevelopment package for the southern waterfront. 8 years of work, completely legal, transparent, publicly audited, the kind of work a name like Santangelo would never be invited to touch. Rafe Santangelo had spent 3 years getting himself to the point where he could sit at the same table as those men. The 8-month engagement had been the final step in those 3 years, and in less than a minute, 5 chairs had gone empty, and all 3 of those years had walked out through the main doors with them. Rafe's expression didn't change. He stood where he was, watched the doors close, then turned to Marisol and told her that the main table area needed to be cleared, and that the staff should be allowed to leave early. That was everything he said in the ballroom that night. The parking lot was on the east side of the building, and Aldo Terzi was waiting beside the car with both hands clasped in front of his stomach. He waited until Rafe reached the car door before speaking. He said he'd stood in that corridor for 30 minutes. He said he understood, that times had changed, that now people handled everything through lawyers. Then he said what he'd really wanted to say, that Rafe's father wouldn't have allowed something like what happened tonight to pass without settling it before the night was over. Rafe opened the car door. He didn't get in right away. He stood there with one hand resting on the roof and said that his father was dead. Then he added that he'd buried the old man twice, once in Malden and once every morning since. Aldo Terzi didn't answer. He lowered his head, stepped back once, and remained there watching until the car drove out of the lot. Before 11 o'clock that night, 3 things had been completed. The contracts department at Sant'Angelo Provisions sent notice to the Windmere suspending all 3 supply arrangements, food, linens, and waste processing, effective with the next morning's deliveries, and the notice stated clearly that service would be restored only after a written employee protection policy was put in place. The finance department sent a letter freezing all funding to the Second Thread Foundation until an independent audit appointed by a third party had reached its findings. And at 10:40, Rafe Sant'Angelo made a phone call that lasted less than 2 minutes and ended his 8-month engagement. The next morning, at 5:40, the Windmere's back courtyard was empty. Not a single truck turned in. Rona Klepper was 45 years old, had managed Sabine Voss for 6 years, and she was the first person to understand that the footage from those 3 cameras couldn't be stopped. She did what any manager does when a story can't be stopped. She went looking for another story. The next morning, she had her assistant open the office archive of correspondence, records that had been kept since the first year for legal reasons, and she searched for the name Rourke. She found it within 40 minutes. 1 letter sent through the mail, and 7 emails, all of them within a 90-day period during the summer 2 years earlier. Rona didn't read all of the contents. She only counted 8 contacts in 90 days, and to her, that number was enough. She forwarded the entire file to an intermediary she regularly used to handle matters like this, and she told him not to publish the contents, only the number. The intermediary took the job, and 3 hours later, he received another call from someone he'd never met, asking how much it would take to get the article onto 3 major news sites instead of 1, and to keep it at the top of the page for 48 hours. The money was paid that same day. Rona Klepper didn't know that call had ever happened. She believed she was saving her client, and to some extent she was right, but the thing she'd just helped wasn't Sabine Voss. The article went live on Thursday afternoon. It didn't fabricate a single word. It said that an employee of the Windmere, the server involved in the incident at that week's gala, had contacted Sabine Voss's office 8 times within 90 days 2 years earlier. It listed the exact date of each contact. It didn't publish a single line from any of those 8 communications, and it didn't say why. The headline used exactly 1 word to describe the woman, and that word was stalker. Within 6 hours, 2 other news sites had republished the story. By that evening, the comments beneath the first article had passed 4,000. People didn't need to know what those 8 messages said. They only needed the number. And the number told a story all by itself. And that story was far easier to believe than the truth. That same afternoon, a new entry appeared in Billy Rourke's personnel file in the Windmere's human resources system. It was a disciplinary warning concerning her work attitude, dated 3 weeks before the gala, bearing the banquet director's signature. No one told her. She learned it existed on Friday morning, when Human Resources called her upstairs and read it aloud to her, and the person reading it was a young woman newly hired, her hands trembling, unable to look up. The first reporter stood outside the house in Dorchester on Friday afternoon. The second and third arrived Saturday morning. They didn't do anything wrong. They stood on the public sidewalk, rang the doorbell once and no more, and waited. But Deirdre's caregiver had to walk past 3 cameras to reach the front door, and by the 3rd day she called Billy. She said she was very sorry. She said she was 60 years old, that she'd been doing this work for 18 years, and that she couldn't have her face appear in the newspapers. She said she would recommend someone else, and she truly did try, but no one accepted the job. Starting Monday morning, there was no longer anyone coming to care for Deirdre Rourke 6 hours a day. Billy asked to be moved to the night shift, so she could be home in the mornings. Marisol approved the request and signed the shift change form with strokes pressed harder into the paper than usual. The night shift ended at 1:15. With 2 train rides after that, Billy reached her front door at 5 minutes to 2. On the 3rd night of the new shift, she unlocked the door, stepped into the kitchen, and didn't turn on the light. She set her bag on the table. Then she lowered herself to the floor, her back against the lower cabinet door, her bandaged right hand resting on her knee, and she sat there for a very long time in the darkness, not crying, not moving, her eyes fixed on the leg of the table. Deirdre Rourke had been awake from the moment she heard the lock turn in the door. She lay still for about 10 minutes, waiting for the sound of footsteps passing through the hallway the way they did every night. And when no footsteps came, she moved herself into the wheelchair in the dark, a task that took her nearly 4 minutes, then rolled into the kitchen. She didn't turn on the light. She stopped about 3 feet from her daughter and looked down at her. She didn't ask whether she was all right. She didn't say everything was going to be fine. She didn't say she was sorry for being a burden to her, even though for the past 4 years she'd thought those words every single day. She simply sat there with both hands resting on the rims of the wheels, and she waited until Billy looked up. Then she told her to give her that hand and let her see it. Billy held out her right hand. Deirdre took it gently in both of hers, careful to avoid the bandage, and held it that way in the darkness. She didn't look at the wound. She looked at her daughter's face. Then she said that Billy's father had supported this whole house with his back. She went on to say that Billy had supported it with her hands, and she said that no one in this house had ever supported it by lying. Billy didn't answer. She left her hand resting between her mother's 2 hands, and she sat there on the kitchen floor until daylight began to gather at the back window. Deirdre didn't go back to bed. She stayed there with her daughter for 2 hours, and in those 2 hours the two of them said perhaps 5 sentences to each other, all of them about things that had nothing to do with the night of the gala. The following afternoon, a car pulled up in front of the house in Dorchester. The 3 people holding cameras on the sidewalk stood, looked at the man getting out, then sat back down, and not one of them raised a camera. Rafe Santangelo walked up the front steps and rang the bell once. Billy opened the door. He didn't ask to come inside. He remained outside the doorway and said he'd come for 2 reasons. The first, he said, was that the article hadn't come from his side, and he was trying to find out where it had come from. The second was an envelope he handed to her. Inside was a check. Billy looked at the amount written on it. It was enough to pay for her mother's caregiver for 4 years. It was enough for her to quit her job, enough to pay for physical therapy for her hand, enough for her to sleep 8 hours a night for the first time since the spring 4 years earlier. She held it for about 10 seconds. Then she put it back inside the envelope, folded the envelope closed, and pushed it toward him. Rafe didn't take it immediately. He asked if she was sure. Billy said she was. Then she added, slowly, that if he paid her this money, tomorrow she would still be someone who could have everything taken away from her with a single phone call. She said that 3 days earlier, 1 phone call had taken away her mother's caregiver. Before that, another phone call had put a piece of paper into her personnel file that she'd never even seen. She said she didn't know who had made those calls, and that was exactly the problem, because she'd never had anything in her hands worth taking, and people had still managed to take everything from her. Then she said the final thing, that if she accepted this check, none of that would change. The string would still be there. He would only be changing the hand that held it. Rafe Santangelo stood still for quite a while. Then he took the envelope back, folded it, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and said he understood. He asked whether she needed anything that wasn't money. Billy said she needed to know who had put that article out. He said he would find out. Before he turned away, he asked one final question, and he asked it in the voice of a man who had been thinking about it for 2 straight days. He asked how long she'd been working at the Windmere, and he asked what she'd done before that. 4 days later, that same car returned to Dorchester at nearly 11 o'clock at night, and this time, it was raining. Rafe Santangelo didn't ring the bell. He sent a single message saying he was waiting outside and had a few questions he wanted to ask. Billy put on a coat, went out, and sat down in the front passenger seat. Neither of them got out of the car. Rain streamed across the windshield in long trails, and apart from the sound of it falling, there was nothing else inside the car. Rafe said he'd had someone look into things, and he said plainly that he'd had someone look into her. He said she'd applied to the Windmere 5 times in 11 months, had been rejected at the application stage every time, and on the 5th attempt, she'd submitted directly to the banquet service team instead of human resources. He said that during the same period she'd been hired by 2 other places, a restaurant in the Seaport and a hotel in Copley, both of which paid more than the Windmere, one of them nearly $3 more an hour, and she'd turned down both offers. Then he asked whether she'd gone to the Windmere looking for him. Billy stared through the windshield for a while. Then she said yes. She didn't apologize, didn't circle around an explanation, and didn't ask how he'd found out. She said her father's name was Colm Rourke. He'd been a tile setter for 41 years, and he'd died on a March morning 4 years earlier on Route 1 at 5:40. He'd been driving to a job site in Saugus. A truck coming from the opposite direction crossed the center line. Her father died at the scene. Her mother had been sitting in the passenger seat, and her mother survived, but she never walked again. Then Billy told him the part she hadn't told anyone in 4 years. She said there had been a logo on the side of that truck. She'd seen it in the accident scene photographs, and that logo belonged to his company. Rafe said nothing. He didn't turn toward her. He kept both hands on the steering wheel even though the engine was off. Billy continued. She said that 3 months after the accident, her family signed a settlement. The amount written on it was $22,000. Their lawyer, a man who charged by the hour, and whom her mother had hired with what remained of the funeral money, told the two of them that it was everything they could possibly get, that the other side had cooperated, that a lawsuit would take 3 years and they might end up with nothing. They signed. She said she believed that document for exactly 7 months. Then one day she read it again, and she realized the settlement listed the amount her family received, but not the amount the insurance company had paid out. Those were 2 different numbers, and no one was required to tell her what the second one was. She said she'd filed 3 requests for copies of the insurance company's internal records. The first had been 3.5 years ago. The second came 9 months later. The third was 2 years ago. All 3 requests were denied, and all 3 denials used the exact same sentence, that the requesting party wasn't a party to the contract, and therefore had no right to access the documents. She said she didn't have a lawyer. She didn't have the money to hire one. She didn't have a single piece of paper that could prove anything except the settlement showing $22,000, and that document proved the opposite of what she needed. For 4 years, she said, she'd been searching for exactly one number, just one number, and she'd never once gotten close to it. Rafe asked why she thought standing in the back courtyard of a hotel would help her find it. Billy said she didn't. She said all she knew was that 3 of his trucks entered that courtyard every morning at 5:40, and she wanted to stand somewhere in this world where she could see that name with her own eyes. She said she hadn't had a plan. She'd only been waiting. Then she told him the last thing. She said that on the night of the gala, when he'd knelt beside her, she'd realized who he was. She said there were 300 people in that room, and 3 cameras running, and she could have said one sentence, just one sentence, and everything he'd spent 3 years building would have been gone. She said she'd thought about doing it. Rafe asked why she hadn't. Billy was silent for a long time. Then she answered that it was because, at that moment, he had been taking off his jacket. Rafe Santangelo sat motionless in that car for nearly another minute, and he couldn't find a single thing to say. He didn't know whether his company had been guilty that night 4 years ago. He only knew, when she opened the car door and stepped out into the rain, that he would have to find out. 9 days after the night of the gala, there were 2 hearings, and they were entirely separate from each other. One had been called by the Windmere's board of directors to review what had happened in the ballroom. The other had been opened by the independent auditing firm to examine the Second Thread Foundation, and that hearing would not take place for another 9 days. The first began on Tuesday morning in the large conference room on the 2nd floor, and it was open to the public because 2 members of the board had requested it after the footage from all 3 cameras was submitted. Billy sat in the front row on the left with Marisol. Pruitt sat on the right beside his personal attorney. Rafe Santangelo sat in the very last row beside the aisle, and for the entire 2 hours he didn't say a single word. He wasn't invited to the table. He didn't submit any documents. He arrived on time and sat quietly, and whenever someone turned around to look at him, he simply kept his eyes facing forward. The chair asked who wanted to speak first. There were about 40 people in the room, and for the first 30 seconds no one moved. Then, from the 4th row, an old man stood up. Everett Coyle was wearing an old coat and carrying a leather briefcase worn smooth at all 4 corners, and he rose slowly because of his knees, but once he was standing, he stood straight. He apologized to the board for not registering in advance to speak. He said his name was Everett Coyle, that he was 79 years old, from Lowell, and that he'd been present that night at table number 9 as an honored guest. Then he described what he'd seen, in the exact order it happened, adding nothing and leaving nothing out. He told them about the lighting. He told them about the 12 place cards and the 9 minutes during which 3 people had knelt on one knee beside the table. He told them about the first glass, and he made it clear that he'd been sitting 7 steps away, that his eyesight was still good, and that he'd seen whose elbow struck the stem of the glass. Then he paused for quite a long time. He said there was one more thing he wanted to say, and that it wasn't evidence, but something personal. He said he'd spent 44 years cutting fabric for other people to wear. He said that on that night, when everything happened, he'd lowered his eyes and looked at his plate. Then he said he was 79 years old now, and he didn't want to carry that evening with him. No one in the conference room spoke. The chair asked whether he wanted to sit down and rest. Everett said he wasn't finished. He placed the leather briefcase on the table in front of him and opened it. He said that for the past 44 years, whenever schools invited him to judge the technical portion of student exhibitions, he'd kept the work of the person he gave the highest score to that term. He said he didn't keep those pieces for any particular reason. He simply kept them, because to him, when a young person made something decent with their own hands, it deserved to be kept. He took out a sheet of paper and a piece of fabric. The paper was his handwritten scoring sheet, bearing the school's letterhead and a date from October 4.5 years earlier. The fabric was raw and undyed, about the size of 2 open hands, and across it were hand-sewn beads arranged backward, layered over one another like fish scales turned against their natural direction. At the bottom corner of the scoring sheet, beneath his technical notes, was the name of the person who had submitted the work, written in his own handwriting. B. Rourke. He said he didn't know who that young woman was. He'd never seen her again after that judging session. He said all he remembered was sitting there that day for more than 20 minutes with that piece of fabric in his hands, because he'd never seen anyone bead fabric in reverse before, and he'd had to remove 3 beads himself to understand how it had been done. Then he said the final thing, and he said it in the voice of a craftsman, not a witness. He said the advertising campaign that carried Sabine Voss out of this city and onto the runways of Europe was launched in April, 18 months after the date written on the paper he'd just placed on the table. The conference room went silent for about 5 seconds. In the front row on the left, Billy Rourke sat perfectly still with both hands resting in her lap, and she didn't look toward the board's table. She looked at the 79-year-old man standing there with his leather briefcase open on the table, and she couldn't say a single word. Everett Coyle sat down, and after him 4 people in the conference room rose one after another. Marisol Quintero, a kitchen assistant, a coat check attendant, and a dishwasher who had worked at the Windmere for 21 years. Billy sat in the front row and listened to every one of them. Marisol spoke first, and she spoke in an even voice, one hand resting on the back of the chair in front of her to keep it from trembling. She described the 3 times she'd tried to step in and take over Billy's shift, and the 3 times she'd been stopped. She described the hand that had been placed on her shoulder. She said she'd worked there for 8 years, and she'd been silent for 8 years. And she said that number like a confession, rather than an accomplishment. The kitchen assistant spoke more briefly, only about 2 minutes, about an evening 3 years earlier that no one had ever heard about. The coat check attendant spoke about something that happened the previous winter, and when she reached the middle of the story, she had to stop and drink some water. The last person was the dishwasher who had been there for 21 years, and he didn't tell any story of his own at all. He only said that he worked downstairs in the kitchen, that he hadn't seen anything that night, and that he'd stood up simply because he wanted the board to know there were people down there too. Billy listened to all of it. She sat still with both hands resting in her lap, and she never once looked toward the board's table. She watched each person as they stood, and she realized something she would continue thinking about for a very long time afterward. She'd worked at the Windmere for 9 months, and she knew all 4 of their faces. She'd passed them every day, nodded hello to them, borrowed their pens, stepped aside for them in the narrow basement corridors, and she'd never known a single one of the stories they'd just told. 4 people, 4 evenings, lying silent inside this building for years, and not one of them had ever told anyone, not even one another. She thought about the 4 years she'd kept silent about her father, and she understood why. People don't stay silent because they're cowards. They stay silent because they've done the math, the same way she'd sat in the private dining room and done the math, and that calculation always came out to the same answer. Except this time, the answer had changed, and it hadn't changed because those 4 people had suddenly become braver. It had changed because a 79-year-old man had stood up first, and once he stood, the price of standing was no longer what it had been before. By noon, the technical department submitted an extract from the personnel system log to the board. The disciplinary warning in Billy Rourke's file, the document dated 3 weeks before the gala, had actually been created in the system at 2:14 in the morning, on the day immediately after the incident, from the banquet director's account. Gideon Pruitt had a 3-year contract and a private attorney sitting beside him, but after that system record was entered into evidence, neither the contract nor the attorney could help him. The board voted during the hearing to terminate him from his position immediately. 9 days later, the second hearing concluded. The independent auditors announced that during its 2 years of operation, the Second Thread Foundation had spent 11% of its total budget on the young designers it claimed to support. The rest had gone to parties, photography, publicity, a seasonal yacht rental, and production costs for a documentary film crew. Sabine Voss stepped down from the foundation's leadership that same week. Giada Santangelo, 26 years old, was appointed by the new board to take over, and the first thing she did was order the release of all records of rejected applications from the previous 2 years. On the final day of the month, the Windmere issued a written employee protection policy. It was 4 pages long, officially stamped, and handed to every employee when they signed their contract. It stated clearly that no guest had the right to touch an employee, No manager had the right to force an employee to accept blame for something they hadn't done, and anyone who reported an incident couldn't be reassigned to another shift, have their hours cut, or have a note placed in their personnel file. On the very first line of page 1 was a sentence Billy had insisted be included, stating that the policy applied to every employee in the hotel, starting with the dishwashers and going all the way up. Rafe Santangelo took 19 days to find what he'd been looking for. He didn't ask anyone inside the organization. He hired an accounting firm in New York, one that had never worked with any company belonging to his family, and instructed them to review 5 years of workplace accident and traffic accident claims records from Santangelo Provisions Group. He paid for it from his personal account. He didn't say a single word to Aldo Terzi. On Saturday afternoon, he came to Dorchester, and this time Billy let him inside. He walked through the living room, past the sewing machine in the corner, and placed the file on the kitchen table. It was the only time he did that in this entire story. Deirdre Rourke sat at the far end of the table. She'd asked to be present, and Billy had agreed. Rafe opened to the first page and began to speak, and he went through everything in order, leaving nothing out, not even the parts he could have left out. The truck on Route 1 that morning had belonged to his company, a food delivery vehicle running the northern route out of the warehouse in Everett. The driver's name was Bertrand Hollis. According to the driving log submitted to regulators, he'd received the required 10 hours of rest before that shift. According to warehouse access card records, fuel records, and 3 time-stamped delivery receipts, he'd been behind the wheel for 19 hours straight. Hollis hadn't written that driving log. It had been reconstructed by the dispatch office, and across 5 years of records, the auditors found more than 400 logs prepared the same way for 27 drivers. The reason was simple. Every extra route a driver could cover meant 1 fewer employee the company had to hire, and every employee they didn't hire meant 1 less expense. Rafe turned to the next page. He said the insurance company had paid $340,000 on the accident claim. He read the number aloud, slowly, once. Then he turned to the settlement agreement, the piece of paper Billy had read over and over for 4 years, and pointed to the line showing the amount the Rourke family had received, $22,000. He said the difference had been recorded under claims handling expenses, moved through 3 intermediary accounts over the course of 11 weeks, and the person who approved the entire chain, the person who dealt with the insurance company, the person who hired the lawyer for the victim's family, and the person who decided the final amount was Aldo Terzi. Billy said nothing. She sat very straight, both hands resting on the table, and stared at the number 340,000 printed on the page. For 4 years she'd been searching for exactly 1 number, and now it lay there less than 2 handspans from her fingers. At the other end of the table, Deirdre lifted a hand to cover her mouth and made no sound. Rafe turned to the final page. At the bottom, beneath the words "Payment Approved," there was a signature. He pointed to it and said it was his signature, dated 4 years earlier, 3 weeks after he'd taken control of the company. He said he hadn't come there to ask for forgiveness, and that he had nothing to ask for. Then he added one more thing, and he said it in the same calm voice he'd used for everything else. He said the accounting firm had sent the signature for handwriting analysis, and the results had come back on Thursday. The signature was forged. Aldo Terzi had signed his name for him, and not just once, but on more than 200 files during the first 3 years after Rafe took his father's place, a period when Rafe had been traveling constantly and signing whatever was placed in front of him. He said he'd known that before he drove there. Billy looked up. She asked why. Then, he'd still said it was his signature. Rafe was silent for a beat. Then he said it didn't matter who had signed it. He was the one who had allowed it to happen. No one in the kitchen spoke for a long time. Billy picked up the final sheet of paper. She held it for a very long time, longer than she needed to read it, and because her right hand was still bandaged, she had to hold it with her left. She looked at the forged signature at the bottom. She thought about that March morning, about her father driving toward Saugus, about the driver she'd never met and had hated for 4 years. Then she put the paper down and said he'd just handed her something that could destroy him. She said his father would never have done that. The 4th-floor hallway of the Federal Building on Sudbury Street was long and narrow, with wooden benches fixed to the walls on both sides, and Billy Rourke sat on the 3rd seat from the elevator. She had been sitting there for 40 minutes. She had been asked to come in to sign a supplemental statement, something that should have taken only 15 minutes, but the clerk said another witness was still being interviewed inside and would be out soon. When the door at the end of the hallway opened, the man who stepped out looked to be nearly 60, his hair almost entirely gray, wearing an old corduroy jacket and holding a knit cap in one hand. He took 3 steps and stopped because he saw her, and he knew who she was. Bertrand Hollis was 58 years old. For the past 4 years, he'd worked as a night security guard at a warehouse in Chelsea, from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning, and he hadn't sat behind a steering wheel once since that March morning. He stood in the middle of the hallway for quite a long time. Then he walked toward her, stopped about 2 steps away, and asked whether she was Mr. Rourke's daughter. Billy said she was. He nodded. He didn't offer his hand. He asked if she minded if he sat down, and she said she didn't. He sat in the chair with one empty seat between them, turning the knit cap over and over in his hands, and he began to speak. He said he'd tried to contact her family 3 times. The first time was 4 months after the accident, the second about a year later, and the third 2.5 years ago. All 3 times, he'd done exactly what he believed was the proper thing. He wrote a request and sent it through the company's legal department because he'd been told that every contact related to the case had to go through them. He didn't know where those requests stopped. He only knew that none of the 3 ever received a reply, and after the third one, someone called him and reminded him that the separation agreement he'd signed contained a confidentiality clause, and that the payment he'd received at the time had come with that condition. He said he had signed it. He had taken the money. He said he wasn't going to deny any of it. Billy asked what he was doing there. Hollis said he'd come to testify. He said no one had called him, there hadn't been any subpoena, that he'd read the news online 2 weeks earlier, seen the company's name, then found the prosecutor's office number himself, and made the call himself. He said they asked whether he had a lawyer, and he said he didn't, and they told him he should have one, and he came anyway. Then he told her the part he'd wanted to tell her. He said that morning he'd been driving for 19 hours. He said he'd asked to stop. He'd called the dispatch office at close to 3 o'clock in the morning and told them he couldn't keep going, and the person on duty told him that if he stopped, he shouldn't bother coming back the next day. He said he'd sat in the cab for 10 minutes thinking. Then he said he'd made the wrong choice. He said those exact words, that he'd made the wrong choice, ma'am, and that he'd paid for it with 4 years of sleepless nights. Billy sat still. She had hated this man for 4 years, even though she'd never known his name, never seen his face, and in her mind he'd always been nothing more than a blurred figure sitting behind a steering wheel. Now he was sitting 1 seat away from her, twisting a knit cap in his hands, and he'd just told her everything without anyone forcing him to say it. She didn't feel lighter. She didn't feel heavier either. She only felt something very strange, that for 4 years she'd been searching for papers, searching for numbers, searching for signatures, and the first thing to come to her by a straight path was a human being. She said she hadn't forgiven him. She said she didn't know when she would be able to, and she wouldn't promise anything today. Hollis nodded and said he hadn't come there to ask for that. Then Billy added one more sentence, and she said it slowly because she was only realizing it as the words came out. She said that in 4 years, he was the first person who had spoken to her with his own mouth. Everyone else had spoken to her through paper. Hollis didn't answer. He sat there a little longer, then stood, put the knit cap on his head, and walked toward the elevator. Halfway down the hallway, he turned back and told her that her father hadn't had time to see anything at all. He said it because he thought she might need to know. Then he left. The auditing firm submitted its final section at the end of the month, and in that final section was something Rafe Santangelo had never asked them to look for. 2 years earlier, beginning on the day Billy Rourke's third request was sent to the insurance company, her name had been placed on an internal watch list maintained by the claims department. That insurance company didn't belong to Santangelo, but the office that decided which files were approved and which were denied across the entire driver division was the dispatch office, and for 30 years the dispatch office had listened to only one man. That was why all 3 of Billy's requests had been denied, and denied with exactly the same wording, because the same person had written those words. Aldo Terzi had known who Billy Rourke was for 2 years before she ever walked into the Windmere. He knew she'd applied for a job 5 times. He knew she stood in the back courtyard at 5:35 every morning. He left her alone because, to him, a woman standing there watching 3 trucks without a lawyer, without documents, and without money, was less dangerous than touching her and making someone else notice. Then came the night of the gala. Aldo stood in the narrow opening of the service corridor door and watched the man he'd served for 30 years kneel beside the very person he'd been watching for 2 years. And in that moment he understood that the 2 most dangerous things in his life had just touched each other right in front of him. The call he made 3 days later, the call that paid to put one article on 3 news sites instead of one, had never been meant to protect Sabine Voss. He didn't care about Sabine Voss. He needed only one thing, that if that woman ever opened her mouth and said the name Colm Rourke, the entire city would already have been given a reason not to believe her. Rafe read that section last, and he read it twice. His people waited in the outer room throughout that afternoon. 3 of them, and none was called inside. There was a way of handling something like this that his father had used 4 times in his life, and Aldo Terzi had personally carried out 2 of those 4. So of everyone still alive, Aldo understood better than anyone what was supposed to happen next. It didn't happen. On Monday morning, Rafe Santangelo walked into the federal prosecutor's office with his attorney and turned over the entire audit file, more than 400 reconstructed driving hour logs for 27 drivers over 5 years, the chain of intermediary accounts, the handwriting analysis of more than 200 signatures, and the payment authorization dated 4 years earlier. He knew exactly what he was handing over. Turning in those records meant exposing his own company to the light. 3 weeks later, Santangelo Provisions Group signed a cooperation agreement, accepted a financial penalty, and agreed to 5 years of judicial oversight, which meant every ledger, every contract, every movement of money across the entire group would be examined every quarter for 5 years by a court-appointed monitor. For an ordinary company, that would have been a penalty. For Rafe Santangelo's company, it was like turning on every light inside his own house and being forbidden to switch them off for 5 years. He knew that before he signed. Aldo Terzi was indicted 6 weeks later. No one came looking for him. Nothing happened to him on the road, and he walked into court on his own 2 feet. What brought him down was more than 200 forged signatures and an 11-week chain of money transfers, and each item was read aloud in the courtroom, one by one, in front of 4 men who had worked under him for 30 years and were sitting in the second row that day. He challenged none of it. On the final day of the month, the Windmere's employee protection policy officially took effect. The banquet staff celebrated in the basement break room after the afternoon shift, with cake and soda, and Marisol Quintero brought her 7-year-old son with her. Emilio ran around the long table in the center of the room with both arms wrapped around a box of cookies bigger than he was. The boy laughed as everyone applauded. Then he ran another lap, and the whole room applauded again. One evening early the following month, Billy sat down at the sewing machine for the first time since the night of the gala, and Deirdre rolled her wheelchair to the kitchen doorway, the way she always had. But this time she didn't stop at the door. She rolled over beside the sewing cabinet and told Billy to open the second drawer. Billy opened it. Deirdre looked inside, then said she'd read everything in there. She said she'd read it for the first time during the summer of the first year, when she still hadn't gotten used to the wheelchair, and it had taken her nearly an hour just to reach that drawer. She said that from then on, she read whenever her daughter was at work, and she'd been reading for 4 years. She knew about the settlement. She knew about the 3 denied requests, and she knew by heart the sentence they used to deny them. She knew about all 5 job applications too, because her daughter had printed every one and kept every copy. Billy asked why her mother had never said anything. Deirdre said because she couldn't stop her, and she couldn't help her either. She said a woman in a wheelchair couldn't go digging through records anywhere, and if she opened her mouth and tried to stop her, her daughter would only hide everything more carefully. Then she told Billy the real reason she'd remained silent for 4 years. She said she hadn't been afraid that her daughter wouldn't find what she was looking for. She'd been afraid of the day her daughter did. She said she'd seen many people spend their lives searching for something like that, and she'd seen what they became when they finally found it. So she hadn't stopped her, and she hadn't helped her. She'd only waited to see what kind of person her daughter would become on that day. Billy asked what she thought now. Deirdre looked at her daughter for a long time, then said, "You're still you," and she closed the drawer. That weekend, an envelope arrived at the house with no sender's name, only a Boston postmark. Billy opened it at the kitchen table. There was no apology inside. Inside was the very letter she'd written by hand and mailed 2 years earlier. The sheet of paper whose every fold she still remembered, and it had been opened, and it had been read. In the right margin of the first page, beside the paragraph where she described the reverse beating technique, there were 3 words written in ink and dated from the summer 2 years earlier. Those 3 words asked, "Is this real?" Billy turned the envelope over. On the back, in different ink and handwriting that had changed, there was another line written more recently. It said, "I knew it was real by the 2nd week." She read it 3 times. Then she folded the letter, put it back inside the envelope, and placed it in the second drawer. She told no one about it, not even her mother. For 4 years, there was one thing Billy Rourke had never touched. $22,000 had remained untouched in a savings account opened 3 months after the funeral, without a single withdrawal, even during the months when she had to delay paying the caregiver, even the previous winter when the furnace broke. She hadn't spent it because spending it would have meant accepting that this was the price of her father. That month, she took the entire amount to the new office of the Second Thread Foundation and sat with Giada Santangelo for 2 hours to write out the conditions. The grant would bear the name Calm Rourke, awarded once each year, providing full tuition for a final-year student forced to leave school because of a family crisis. The only condition was that the recipient didn't have to write an essay thanking anyone. Rafe Santangelo came to Dorchester one final time on a Thursday afternoon. He brought nothing with him. He said he'd come to say everything plainly once and be done with it. Then he told her what he was, using the exact words everyone in the city avoided saying aloud, and he didn't soften a single one of them. He said the 5 years of judicial oversight were only the beginning. He said he needed at least another 4 years to bring everything else into the light. And he said he was moving slowly not because he was afraid, but because if he moved too quickly, people would die, and the people who died wouldn't be him. Billy said she couldn't be the reason for that. She said she'd already lived for 4 years inside something where she was the reason, and she didn't want to live another 4 years that way. Rafe said she wasn't the reason. He said that before her, he'd never believed anyone could do something like that and still remain entirely themselves. He said she was proof that it could be done. Then he said goodbye to Deirdre, thanked both mother and daughter, and left. He didn't promise anything, and he didn't ask for anything either. Before this story comes to an end, we'd like to ask you one thing. If you could choose exactly one word you believe every human being in this world deserves to receive, no matter what work they do, no matter where they stand in the room, what would that word be? Leave it in the comments. We read every single line. And if this story touched something in you, please leave a like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you can join us in listening to new stories every day. 1 year later, the ballroom at the Windmere still welcomed the 4 o'clock afternoon light through its row of west-facing windows, light that fell diagonally across the stone floor in long bands. That Friday afternoon, there was a tea gathering for an association of retired teachers, about 40 guests, and among the service staff was a young woman working her very first day. Junie Faircloth was 21 years old, had been hired on Monday, and this was the first tray she'd ever carried in her life. She made it halfway down the main aisle when a guest pushed a chair backward. The tray tilted, 2 cups slid toward one side, and Junie froze in the middle of the room, her face turning white, her mouth already beginning to apologize very quickly, apologizing over and over, the way people apologize when they believe they've ruined everything on their very first day. A hand reached out, caught the edge of the tray, and steadied it. Billy Rourke was 30 years old, floor manager at the Windmere since March, and she supported the tray with her right hand. Sensation had returned to the tip of her index finger, not completely the way it had been before, but enough to tell one surface of fabric from another, and enough to hold a needle. She rearranged the 2 cups, brought the tray level again in Junie's hands, then told the young woman that mistakes happen. Then she added that here, no one had the right to make her feel small. Junie looked at her for a second, then nodded, then kept walking. At table number 9, an old man set down his cup and looked up. Everett Coyle was 80 years old, still came for lunch 3 times a week, always sat in exactly that same place, and never made a reservation. He nodded to Billy across the distance of 7 steps. She nodded back. At the far end of the room, beside the stone column on the right, a man sat alone in front of a cup of coffee that had gone cold a long time ago. No one was with him. No one stood at the service corridor door. Rafe Santangelo looked up at exactly the moment Billy glanced in that direction, and the 2 of them looked at each other for about a second. Then she turned back to her work, and he lowered his eyes to his coffee. Neither of them walked over. Nothing more was needed. 4 blocks away, inside the gallery of the Second Thread Foundation, a small glass display case stood just inside the entrance. Beneath the glass lay a piece of raw, undyed fabric, about the size of 2 open hands, covered with hand-sewn beads arranged in reverse, layered over one another like fish scales turned against their natural direction. Beside it was a small card bearing the date of a student exhibition 5 years earlier, along with the name of the person who had created it. Once every year, in that same room, the foundation awarded a full tuition grant bearing the name Calm Rourke to a final-year student forced to leave school because of a family crisis. The recipient didn't have to write a single word of thanks. Reputation can make an entire room turn its head, but only dignity can make that room stand up. Thank you for staying with us until the very final moment of this story. How do you feel about Billy? About Mr. Everett? About the people who chose to stand when standing wasn't easy at all? Share what you truly feel in the comments, because we genuinely want to hear what lies deep inside your heart. We wish you and your family lasting good health, peaceful days, and a joyful, calm life. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.